Firstly, that data is very clear that if you look across epidemiological studies, millions of individuals in these studies, a very simple truth comes out, which is that the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. That short sleep predicts all-cause mortality.
Wow.
They serve caffeine liberally.
Yeah.
And the other thing they serve is alcohol, and I'd love to speak about that too, because both of those are the very best ways to disrupt your sleep. But caffeine is a misunderstood drug. It is a drug. It's what we call a psychoactive stimulant. But what's interesting is that caffeine has a quarter life of about 12 hours. What this means is that if you have a cup of coffee at noon, a quarter of that caffeine is still circulating around your brain at midnight. Caffeine is the only psychoactive stimulant that we do give to our children readily. Again, I think it's just that parents probably don't understand the impact of caffeine in that regard. Some people say, look, I'm one of those people who can drink a cup of coffee in the evening, have an espresso after dinner, and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep. Now, even if that's true, there was an alarming study that was done where they gave people just one single cup of coffee, and then they measured the quality of their deep sleep by tracking these big, powerful brain waves. It helps also restore the body. And what they found was that caffeine in the evening decreased the amount of deep sleep by 20%. Now, you would have to normally age by about 15 years to produce that type of a deficit in your deep sleep. And what's interesting is that those people will wake up the next morning. Quality of their deep sleep was so poor that they will still then feel unrestored and unrefreshed by their sleep.
I need more caffeine.
And so here is the irony. So I think people are perhaps unaware of the true impact of caffeine. And even if you feel that you're immune to that evening cup of coffee, how it will still impact your sleep. I also love the coffee culture as well. You know, I go out with friends and we grab coffee all the time, and I love that. And I want people to embrace it because I think it's fantastic that there's a social movement just thinking a little bit about caffeine and considering it and just try the experiment. You know, sort of set yourself the task, give it a go, and see if it works for you. And if you look at lots of sports athletes, you know, LeBron James, the basketball player, he suggests that he gets somewhere between 10 and 11 hours. He says he never gets anything less than 9 hours. And I believe for one of his world records, he had only been awake for about 35 minutes because he'd taken a nap.
Oh, I love it.
Right before, I think it was an Olympic gold and a world record that he broke. Because they're starting to realize that sleep is probably the greatest legal performance enhancing drug that you could ever wish for. Yeah, so right now the recommendation is for most adults, get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. I think that's what many people miss in recommendations from sort of experts. They say, get your 7 hours of sleep. So people think that means, you know, well, if I go to bed at, 11 p.m. and I wake up at 6 a.m., then I've got my 7 hours of sleep. That's not true. You probably will have only logged about sort of 6 hours and 40 minutes, and that's not enough. And, you know, the analogy, I guess, would be a drunk driver at a bar. You know, they've had a couple of pints, maybe a few shots, and they pick up their car keys and they say to you, you know, look, I'm fine to drive home. Yeah. And you say, no, I know that you think you're fine to drive home, but trust me, you're not. It's the same way with a lack of sleep, that our subjective sense is a miserable predictor of objectively how well we're doing with a lack of sleep. I think the other thing that's problematic too about getting too little sleep is that your baseline level of how you think your health and your wellness is just becomes chronically low, and you accept that as if that's just where I am in life. This is just me. There's actually a better form of you waiting on the other side of those things.
Absolutely.
It just requires perhaps, you know, some knowledge and an invitation to go there. Firstly, that data is very clear that if you look across epidemiological studies, millions of individuals in these studies, a very simple truth comes out, which is that the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. That short sleep predicts all-cause mortality.
Wow.
And I liken where we are with sleep with where we were for smoking 50 years ago. All of the science was there, but it hadn't trickled down into the public knowledge base. What happens is that people have this braggadocio attitude, this almost sort of sleep machismo attitude, that you're very proud to tell people how little sleep that you're getting, as though it's... And from everything I can tell, sleep is perhaps one of the most democratic, freely available, efficacious forms of health insurance that you could ever wish for. Coin, what happens when we don't get enough sleep? Firstly, we know that people who are sleeping 5 hours a night are 4 times more likely to catch a cold than those people who are sleeping 8 hours or more.
Wow.
We also know if you take healthy individuals and then we limit them to just 4 hours of sleep for one single night, what we see is a 70% drop in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells. Deep sleep is the most wonderful form of natural blood pressure medication that you could ever wish for.
Yeah.
But one of the other things is that we see, as that nervous system quiets down, levels of things like cortisol drop down, that stress-related chemical. And it's during that time that the body goes into an immune stimulation mode. Could imagine the cost savings to, our economy. In fact, the Rand Corporation recently did a survey, the enormous cost of sleep deprivation throughout a number of developed nations. What they found was that a lack of sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. So here in the United Kingdom, that's 30 billion pounds of lost economic value caused by insufficient sleep. In the United States, it was $411 billion. In Japan, it was $138 billion. In other words, if you solve the sleep loss epidemic, imagine you could almost double the budget for education, or you could perhaps even halve the healthcare deficit. Yeah, so there's probably maybe 5 things that people can do right now to get better sleep. The first is regularity. Going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time, no matter what. Sort of sleep too late at the weekend, and then on Sunday night you've got to drag your body clock all the way back and try and force it to sleep at a time when you haven't been sleeping before. That's torture. Regularity is key. The second thing is temperature. Keep your bedroom cool. Probably around about 18 degrees Celsius, which is colder than most people think. But cooling the room down takes your body into that right sort of thermal space for good sleep. It cools it down. Darkness, we've spoken about too, and you need darkness at night to allow the release of a hormone called melatonin, which helps time the healthy onset of your sleep. Yes, it's to do with blue light sort of emitting devices, screens, phones. Those are things that you should try and stay away from in the last hour before bed. It's also overhead lighting. We don't need to be bathed in electric light all night. In the last hour before bed, just try turning half of the lights off. You'd be surprised at how soporific and sleepy you become. The fourth thing is, I would say, walk it out. And what I mean by that is, don't stay in bed if you've been awake for 20 or 25 minutes. The reason is because your brain is this wonderfully associative device, and it will start to very quickly learn that being in bed is about being awake rather than asleep. Only return to bed when you are very sleepy, and that way your brain will start to relearn the association that your bedroom is the place of sleep. The final 2 things, one of which we've mentioned, is what you intake into your body, caffeine and alcohol. We've spoken about caffeine, but I'll speak about alcohol quickly. Many people use alcohol as a sleep aid. Alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. Unfortunately, it's very,
sedation is not sleep.
It's
I love
very
it.
different. So what you're doing when you have a nightcap or you use alcohol to try and get to sleep, you're just knocking your cortex out. You're not in natural sleep. So if I were to record someone's sleep in the laboratory after they've had a couple of drinks, their sleep is littered with all of these awakenings throughout the night. But the next day you feel, again, unrefreshed. You don't feel sort of bright and alert or restored by your sleep. But you don't remember waking up, so you don't link it to the alcohol. But alcohol is bad at fragmenting your sleep, produces poor quality. Now, everyone, should, have a social life and sort of, enjoy a drink now and again. I think the best advice would be this. If you're going to bed feeling tipsy, you probably have had too much alcohol in terms of sleep impairment. See, I don't want to sound puritanical. Life is to be lived. But I also want to empower people with the knowledge. I'm not here to tell you necessarily what you should or you shouldn't do. I just want to give you the scientific facts, and then you can make the choice.